welcome everyone. We have a incredible webinar scheduled for tonight, and it's all about really how to identify, prevent, and reduce anxiety with your child. We have an incredible guest speaker, but just to tell you a little bit about tonight's session, you can see us, but we cannot see you. You're on mute, but please use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you may have tonight. Share your questions as they arise. We will do our best to address as many questions as time allows tonight. This presentation is being recorded and will be emailed to all of our families after tonight's event. So why don't we get started? So ESF, we've been operating camps since 1982, and we have certainly seen this topic become very popular due to several factors. We have seen an increase in awareness of mental health with schools, with camps, with everyday life. And we've also seen an increase over the last 42 years in diagnosed cases, with the amount of children who are diagnosed with anxiety disorders. Also, life changes, and the impact of modern life is now becoming more fast-paced, high expectations, and constant connectivity that our children have can really contribute to those increased anxiety levels in children, where it really does create academic pressure, social media pressure, and changes within family dynamics play a role in that anxiety. And also with the societal and environmental changes, like the pandemic, where we've seen how that has significantly impacted children's mental health, as well as cyberbullying that you read about in the news. Tonight's specialist is truly an expert. Dr. Zach Radcliff is from Nemours Children's Health. He's been an expert panelist with us over the course of the last year and a half. We've been really blessed to have him. He's a pediatric clinical psychologist. He works in the integrated primary care at Nemours Children's Health in Delaware. He's passionate about equitable access to mental health services, telehealth, and supporting healthcare workers across all disciplines. He has various areas of focus with eating disorders, the inclusion, the chronic medical conditions, and autism. Of note, he's been the head counselor and a camp psychologist for various summer camps over the past 20 years, and he's also an avid fan of the beach, his garden, and his family. He's got a number of younger children as well. He relates to this topic. He's got his really hand on the pulse of what's going on right now. So welcome, Dr. Zach.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here with everyone tonight and talking about this. I think you hit the nail on the head there as far as, we're hearing more families talk about this, understand this, recognize the need, for, mental health services in general, but certainly hearing lots about anxiety and thinking more about that. And so have some slides to kind of run through tonight, but also want to save some time for questions and want to spend some time really thinking about some of the things that are on you all's minds. And so tonight we're going to kind of run through just a little bit of, what we know about anxiety, kind of what it looks like, and then thinking about, how do we kind of support and or prevent anxiety as best we can. And then certainly thinking about, if you kind of need to escalate to someone like myself, to a professional. So we'll take a look through all of that tonight, but first we're going to kind of jump in and just talk about what anxiety looks like throughout childhood. And so, here's a kind of brief overview of what anxiety is. So anxiety is apprehension without apparent cause. So we're kind of thinking about this as there's no immediate threat to safety or well-being, but it feels real. And so when we think about, that being different than fear, where fear is a normal reaction to a real threat to safety, right? So fear is like you're standing there looking at a bear and it's staring at you like your lunch. That's fear. That's not anxiety. That's a real threat to your safety. Now, if your body starts to have that same reaction when you're, sitting at home with your family and feeling safe, or should be feeling safe otherwise, but your body is having that reaction like there's a bear in the room. That's anxiety. And so it is important to kind of distinguish that when we're thinking about kids, especially because there may be very real fears or things that they're trying to understand or better understand about their world and the world around them, and what is real, what isn't real. And so sometimes it's helpful to be thinking about some of that and kind of keep those differences kind of straight in your brain as best you can. And we know that anxiety starts, all the way back in infancy. So we'll see infants, have separation anxiety and be upset when you're handing them off to somebody else, even if it's like a grandparent or somebody that you know really well. They may not know that person very well, and so we see that separation anxiety, and that is kind of typical for most kids through the preschool years. And it varies. Some kids, kind of adjust and transition through some of that much quicker. Other kids, it can take them a really long time, and it can be a little bit more difficult to navigate and deal with, some of that separation anxiety. As we're also kind of thinking about that toddler to preschool range, we see some of these short-lived fears. So being afraid of storms or the dark or animals or strangers, where it may be present for a couple months, but oftentimes through a lot of, your kind of typical parenting strategies and the normal things that you do on a regular basis of reassurance and providing a safe environment, kids are going to kind of move through these fears. And so we often, kind of think about these as also fairly typical and tending to be things that like most families can kind of manage, at home, or with maybe some of the resources, that we will share, with you all. There's a blog post available that's got a bunch of resources. And so you can certainly kind of take a look at that and use some of those for these types of things. As kids start to get a little bit older, then we start to get this fantasy fear, right? Fear of things that maybe aren't real, or maybe, aren't necessarily present in the same way. So monsters under the bed, or, kind of being scared of something that they saw in a dream, or, kind of had, some idea about or saw in a commercial. Or maybe they walked downstairs, and you were watching a horror movie around Halloween, and they walked in, on some scary part, and then they've got this kind of image in their head. And so it's really easy for kids in this like 4 to 5 range to like see one image or one flash, and they can get fixated on it. And so then you're kind of trying to re-divert, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the strategies that can help with some of this. But that's really common for kids. Then we start to get these reality-based fears, in kind of middle childhood, somewhere around 7 years old, kind of starting to hear kids talking more about like worried about getting hurt or disasters, natural disasters. There was a big tornado in Iowa yesterday. And so I already heard somebody talking about like, hey, I saw a kid today that was worried about tornadoes and worried about storms. And so we know that like as kids hear about these things on the news or on the radio, or, hear other kids talk about them, sometimes they have these fears of like, wow, this could happen. We know that the anxiety around a school shooting has significantly increased in the US over the past 15 years. And so we have kids that have very real, fears about this happening. And then we're also hearing a lot of kids, talking about things like climate change and worrying about that. And there's actually a term for that, solastalgia, which is kind of the fear, that your natural environment is being destroyed. And it's kind of like the anxiety of the loss of that. And again, some of these are very real fears, but also then sometimes there can be anxiety that develops from that. And so being kind of aware of some of these things that kids are hearing about or talking about is really important as far as then being able to understand your child's anxiety and the things that they might be worried about. So when we're thinking about anxiety and like, what does this look like? There's kind of physical symptoms of anxiety. Some of these can be associated with panic attacks, or things like that. There's also kind of like mental or internal aspects of anxiety that maybe aren't as visible. Maybe you're hearing them from your child, but maybe not necessarily seeing them. Certainly thoughts are not things that are always visible. And so thoughts and feelings kind of hide inside, whereas the behaviors and the physical reactions are very kind of visible. And one of the things that's important to be aware of, anxiety is one of the mental health conditions that is most connected to, kind of your physical body. So we tend to see the most kind of physical symptoms associated with anxiety out of any of the mental health conditions. Largely due to the fact that the way that kind of anxiety works biologically in your body, it creates things like cortisol and other, kind of stress hormones and things like that, which then have, real downstream effects in your body. And so we see things like hyperventilation, getting sweaty and hot, or some, people get clammy and cold. You'll see, some people have kind of the red, skin, or they get blotchy, increased heart rates, upset stomach. That's one of those kind of downstream effect ones. Even just like, impact on diet, eating, thinking about that upset stomach again. Sometimes for little kids that can turn into they're throwing up or vomiting. Sometimes it's turning into like, hey, I'm having lots of diarrhea, or I'm going to the bathroom a lot. We see that for some kids, they're talking more than normal. Some kids are talking way less than normal. They might be clinging or hiding behind you, might be kind of refusing to go somewhere. And you may be seeing, if it's kind of a long-term anxiety, you might be seeing an impact on sleeping or eating habits, and some of those more kind of day-to-day routine type of things. And so the challenge, as you can imagine here, is trying to figure out like, is my child anxious, or did they just run around and play outside and, are, like just hot and sweaty and need a drink? And trying to understand like what is going on if your child maybe comes in upset, but they've also been outside, and did they get a scrape, or are they feeling upset because somebody teased them, or they're having some other worry or some other thing that might be kind of going on mentally. And so it's a tough balance. You're kind of trying to play detective with some of these physical aspects. But I find that a lot of parents really have a good sense for how their child's anxiety looks or presents. When we think about kind of the mental end of things, certainly some kids are going to tell you like, I'm worried about this, or they're going to, be very verbal and be able to describe it. And tell you like, I am, worried that, we're going to have a tornado because there was a tornado yesterday, and I heard that storm is coming here, and I'm really worried about that. And they may be able to voice it really easily. Some kids are not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to describe it and also think developmentally. Kids start to understand their emotions somewhere in that preschool range. And as they go through childhood and into the teenage years, they go from, knowing and understanding like 4 core emotions to having, upwards of like 50 emotions that they're able to kind of understand and describe. And so there's a process too of like, I may not have the words for this. And so you are seeing it physically, you are seeing the irritability or, other changes in behavior, refusal to do things, increased shyness, maybe like changing the topic or not wanting to talk about the thing that they're worried about or anxious about. And sometimes you're even seeing kids, kind of show their anxiety by being hard on themselves, or, having some of that low self-esteem of, I'm not good enough for this, or I can't do it. And that's, more of them like, well, I'm nervous that maybe this is a new thing that I'm trying, and I don't know if I'll be good at it. And so I'm worried to try this new thing. And so I'm just going to tell people, I don't like it, or I'm not good at it, and so I shouldn't do it. And that is a go-to move for our oldest child. And so we're very familiar with hearing those, kind of anxiety comments come up when it's really like, hey, this is a new thing and I'm nervous to try it. And so it is a little bit of detective work. It is a little bit of piecing some of this together. And certainly there's other ways that anxiety presents, and there's other ways that, this may look. And then certainly, as you can imagine, we're going to need to address some of these things in very different ways, and think about, how are we going to do this differently. So for younger kids, we're thinking about parent-led supports are tending to be most effective. So parents and caregivers, those people that are supporting kids, are the ones that are doing a lot. And so you may be talking through or challenging those fears. So just learning more, right? Kids may not have the words at, 4 years old to tell you what they're worried about, or be able to describe like what the monster looks like that they're afraid of. But maybe you can draw a picture of it and that can help you understand why they're worried about it. Or they can help you, understand in some other way. And so sometimes just giving them space to talk, and then gently challenging. And I use the word gently, or words gently challenging, because sometimes it can be helpful just to point out a counter thought. Because a lot of times for our younger kiddos, they haven't thought about like another viewpoint or another possible outcome for some of those situations. So, like, hey, I am sure that when my parents, walk out of my bedroom and close the door after, putting me to bed, that like the monster's going to come out of the bed, out from under the bed. And you may be able to say, like, well, you've been alive for 4 years and no monster has ever come out from under the bed, has it? And like that's a whole 4 years that like have never had that happen. And so that might be a really kind of like simple, gentle way to just kind of like help your kid go, oh yeah, that never has happened. And so why would it happen now? And so again, sometimes it's just, real simple conversations, or real simple kind of redirections or restructuring of some of those thoughts. Sometimes walking them through relaxation can be really helpful. Sometimes doing kind of a deep breathing exercise, we're going to smell the roses and then blow out the candles, right? So breathe in through your nose, and then we're going to blow out the birthday candles, right? And helping kids to practice slow, deep breaths is really powerful for a lot of kids. Sometimes, if they can count, having them count up to 10 and back down again. Sometimes kind of talking through the happy place, right? So talk about a positive memory. Hey, we like went to the beach last summer and we had so much fun. And do you remember, when like dad came up out of the ocean and he had seaweed all over him and that was really silly and he was grossed out. And you can kind of bring in, some of those silly or fun or happy memories that they might have. It makes it even more powerful if you can do things like tie some of this sensory experiences into this. So thinking about, like, hey, like, do you remember how loud the waves were? Or do you remember like the sound of the seagulls? Do you remember what the ocean smelled like? Do you remember what it felt like to be buried in sand? Do you remember what it was so windy that day and like we got sand blown at us and that was wild. We had to turn our umbrella on the side and hide, and right. And you can bring in a lot of pieces of the memory. We know that people connect to a memory more when there's this kind of sensory components to it, and it can make it a more powerful kind of mental experience for them. So I love kind of walking through some of those things with kids, and just thinking through like, hey, what's that favorite memory, and how can we think about this when you're feeling worried or feeling nervous. Certainly for our younger kiddos too, distraction and diversion often works, especially if it's one of those, kind of fears that is not maybe a long lasting fear, or might be one of those kind of brief fears that, hey, I'm worried about monsters under my bed. Okay, like, why don't we, do this fun thing where we're going to create like monster spray and fill up a bottle of water and decorate it with, all sorts of, silly things to get rid of the monsters. And then we're going to spray under the bed, once with that. And like, now you've gotten them focused on an art and craft, and they're not even worried about the monsters anymore. And certainly there's lots of other ways that you can distract and divert. The key here is for younger kids, we're not necessarily thinking about this being avoidance of the fear, but more so, hey, like, this is a really small fear, or a fear that, we don't need to spend too much focus or attention on. And so we're just gonna kind of ignore it and move right on, and just kind of brush past it. And so it's not that you're trying to ignore your child or invalidate them, but you're also kind of, letting them know that, like, hey, this isn't a big deal, and we can keep going with what we're doing. So like, yeah, I heard that you say that you're scared of the dark. You know what? And we know that you're safe here. And why don't we go brush your teeth? And so you can acknowledge it and move right along. And we do lots of that. Our youngest, 5 years old, is a great bedtime staller, and uses lots of worries that they craft on the fly usually, but uses lots of like, like, well, what if, the nightlight goes out while I'm sleeping, and what if this happens? And, what if I'm in the dark, or what if this, and lots of what ifs that are kind of these little worries, but largely are kind of like trying to stall and just get more time, with us parents. And so we kind of acknowledge, but then keep moving right along, and like, hey, we're going to finish reading the story, or I'm going to finish singing the song, and then, it's lights out. So
Correct.
again, distract. Oh yeah,
Yeah, just a question for you. So,
yeah,
in the Rouse house where there's 4 young kids under the age of 11, we're finding that with maybe 1 or 2 of our children, the environment plays a big part. So if they have just played perhaps Minecraft or some technology game, that may have increased the stress that they have now, just done a game, and that carries forward in some cases. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Just like, if it was a TV show or a movie that, 2 of them love, but they saw something about it and that just really triggered something.
yeah. It's a great question, and one that we deal with as well, in our house. Where, hey, like, we thought we were having a lot of fun watching Star Wars, but then suddenly it's bedtime, and like, one of them is like, hey, like, I can't stop thinking about, Jabba the Hutt, and I'm really scared of like, going to bed, and like, I can't stop thinking about him, or I'm worried about him. And so sometimes, again, they'll kind of latch on to like one image or one moment, that they kind of experienced. And so, again, that's a moment where you can kind of acknowledge, like, yeah, that was a little bit scary, or that was a little bit funny. You can, kind of talk about how it's not real. And especially depending on the age range, some younger kids are like, wait, Jabba the Hutt's not real. Apologies if anybody is watching this and didn't know that Jabba the Hutt is not real, but sometimes we kind of run into that of like, no, like, that's a giant puppet, right? And like, we've even done the thing where we've pulled up pictures of like the deconstructed Jabba the Hutt, because that was one that we went through, and showed them like, yeah, Jabba the Hutt's just a giant puppet. And then like, wanted to learn all about the other puppets on Star Wars, and is no longer afraid of any of the like characters or creatures in Star Wars. And so sometimes it is kind of just like, hey, we're going to lean into this for a second, and acknowledge it, but then kind of redirect it, reminding kids, this isn't real, or this is, pretend, even if it is something that's real, right? So like, hey, you're turning off the TV, and like, you turned off Netflix, and then it happened to pop onto like the news. and they see that like picture of the tornado, and it's like, oh, is that here? And right, and you can kind of reassure, talk, give them a moment of like feeling safe and helping them to feel safe, and then kind of redirect on. And especially, I think these are ones that I think of as the fleeting fears. And there are some kids that are just more wired towards anxiety, where they're going to have these fears that just kind of pop up as they see something, and they're curious and they want to learn about it. And so it's like, hey, like, why don't we talk more about tornadoes tomorrow, when you're not trying to go to bed? But, like right now, I want you to know that like you're safe. And if anything does happen, like we can, do this thing to make sure that we keep you safe if for whatever reason there was a tornado or whatever, or, mommy and daddy have a plan, to deal with that if something scary like that happens. And so you can kind of give that little bit of reassurance and then kind of redirect back to the task. But yeah, that can come up for a lot of kids, and can definitely be a challenging one. And I think especially at bedtime, or especially in the evening, I think sometimes we see those pop up or kind of stick with some kids for sure. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so jumping ahead a little bit. So, I mean, the last thing for younger kids, they really sometimes benefit from like those positive statements or those mantras of like, I can do it, or like, I'm stronger than this, or I can be brave, or things like that. I think your preteens and teens are going to roll their eyes maybe a little bit more. But there's even versions of that, that can work for them. So, just helping them to kind of like feel confident in themselves, right? Their anxiety may not be about monsters. It may be about like, upcoming tests. And it's like, okay, like let's talk about how well you've done on these other tests. And like, we know you can do it. And, like we want you to try your best, and, like, let's make sure that we do the appropriate stuff to make sure you're prepared. Like, we don't want to reinforce the anxiety by saying like, let's do tons of extra studying, but let's do the appropriate amount of studying to make sure you're ready for that test. And kind of model that for them. And modeling is really important, and we're going to talk about that in a minute when we talk about kind of preventative stuff. But modeling is really helpful. Talking through how you're kind of appropriately managing your own anxiety, because everyone has anxiety, and modeling, your management goes a long way for kids, and teenagers and preteens still benefit from relaxation skills. It may look a little different. One of my favorite ones is called grounding. It, pulls in the senses, and you can do everything from like grounding, like right now, you could ground yourself in the chair or whatever you're sitting in by just focusing on, feeling the back of the chair against your back or against your legs as you're sitting there, right? Your brain normally tunes that out, but now that I'm talking about it, you're probably paying attention to it and aware of, that contact that's being made. And that kind of pulls you back into the present moment. We know grounding is really powerful because, when you think about it, your brain prioritizes those senses and those sensory experiences over almost anything else, because that's how we know when we're in danger. And so if you can tie yourself kind of back into, the current present moment in a stable and kind of safe way, like I feel really supported by this chair, and I can feel it against my back, and I know that I'm, not going anywhere as I sit here, and I feel supported, under my legs, and, I feel supported by my feet on the floor, and I can wiggle my toes in the carpet, because I'm not wearing shoes right now. And I can hear and listen to the world around me, and hear the like air purifier that's blowing behind me right now, to drown out the noise of my kids in the background. And so, there's lots of ways that you can kind of tie, back into the physical environment. And there's lots of awesome, like YouTube and apps, things like that, walk kids through grounding, walk kids through some of these exercises. And again, that blog post on the website has a lot of those great resources in it. And some of the apps that are my favorites. There's certainly lots of other ones out there too. And then certainly helping kids to identify what's a stress reducing activity for them. What helps them kind of relax and calm down? What helps them feel, just kind of more at ease? Whether it's a time when they're feeling stressed or feeling anxious, or whether it's a time when they're just generally kind of, feeling good and want to do something else that kind of helps them feel calm and good. Certainly kind of like things that are not necessarily connected to screens, although there's certainly some great stress reducing apps again, and different things like that. That can be really helpful. But drawing, music, going for a walk, finding out whatever those things are, and whatever that might be, kind of a beneficial thing for them. And then finally, all kids benefit from practice, and actually adults do too. Facing your fears is really powerful. We call it exposure therapy, and there's even kind of a version called exposure and response prevention. So for people who have lots of kind of physical symptoms that go along with it, how do we help you kind of face the fear, but also then not have those physical symptoms? And so, if you are needing to kind of look for therapy, we see really good effect from these types of interventions that a therapist or psychologist or somebody could do with you or your child. But kind of facing, those fears in a gradual way. So I think about this, if we go with like a fear of spiders, somebody who maybe is, super afraid of spiders, and terrified of them, we might start by just like looking at a picture of a spider. Or maybe even drawing pictures of spiders together. And then we might look at real pictures. And we might first look at pictures of like super cute peacock spiders, or super cute ones that are like zoomed out, so you're not seeing all the eyes and stuff like that. And then maybe we're going to zoom in, and then maybe we're going to watch a video, and then maybe we're going to, send you on a field trip to go to like the local zoo and like check out their insect exhibit. And then, maybe depending on like what level we need to go to and what the goal is, like we might be trying to find like tame spiders that you could handle. Often I find that people are happy, like kind of getting to the point where like, hey, I can see a spider and exist in a room with a spider. But like I don't need to go any further beyond that. I don't have to handle spiders in my day-to-day life, and so we don't need to like get over that level of the anxiety. That's not impairing to me. But again, kind of gradually practicing that, these are things that families can do with their kids. I think another example is I had a family where kiddo was afraid of baths and the bathtub. And so, what we worked on was like making the bathtub fun again. And so like, hey, we're going to play in the bathtub, and we are going to, do all sorts of silly games and not even try and take a bath, but we're just going to get you used to like, this can be a safe place for me to be, and a place for me to hang out and make this comfortable. And so, there's lots of ways that parents can kind of support these practices, help their kids kind of face some of these fears, and support them through that process, and also turn it into like fun and or kind of brave, situations where, hey, we're going to be brave together, or we're going to have this fun together. And who knew that like we could play silly games in the bathtub?
Dr. Radcliff, here's a great question that just came up. How
Yeah.
much, how much do you push, when a refusal comes in from your child? How do you push them to do that one thing versus kind of give in and let them walk away and not go? There's an example a parent has just provided where, for instance, going to karate class, where they're refusing to go when it's not their first time. They may be, really making great progress at karate. They understand the process. They understand the sport. They're getting it. This isn't a first time thing, and they're just refusing to go.
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's the perhaps $1 million question sometimes in these situations, is like, where do I draw the line? Where do I find that balance? And so sometimes it is kind of sitting down with your kiddo, depending on the age, and thinking about, hey, is this something that's really important to you, and like you really want to go to karate, but hey, it's really hard for me to go in there because I'm afraid of getting hurt. And so how do we help you, kind of manage that fear? And so sometimes trying to understand the fear a little bit better, and slowing it down. And you may hear the first like 20 times you ask the question is like, I don't know, or I'm just not going, or right, something like that, where they're not getting to it, and helping you understand. And so you may have to give examples of like, are you worried about getting hurt? Or are you worried about somebody being mean? Or are you worried about being away from, us? Or, kind of setting up some of those examples for them to then be able to talk about, or kind of express a little bit easier to you. And so maybe something that then is like, oh, hey, we can answer that, or we can support that. And then we don't even have to fight the battle anymore, because we've been able to kind of have this conversation, and understand this worry or this fear a little bit better. Sometimes it is, hey, this is a, new fear, or it's a new thing, and they're not really able to connect to it, or they're not really able to talk about it, or they're too young to kind of understand what they're worried about. And so that can be where you do some of that gradual practice. So this could be an example where you're saying, okay, you know what, like tonight, we're going to just like go and we're going to hang out, for 5 minutes in the lobby of the karate place. Or maybe you go visit on a day that's like not actually a karate lesson, so that, you're not feeling like maybe you're wasting your money by going for 5 minutes and then leaving. And so you can kind of maybe work with the studio of like, hey, we just want to come and like help our child to feel comfortable here. And we're going to continue to kind of practice and get them just kind of used to the space, used to coming here, and kind of work on that. One of the things, that I think about, as well, certainly is, like reward systems, and kind of reinforcing or rewarding brave behaviors. And kind of thinking about, how do we, kind of encourage, your child to kind of engage with some of this, and not that like you'll be rewarding them for the rest of their life for going to karate, but like as they're able to do it, then you can kind of phase out rewards, because hopefully then there's kind of that intrinsic reward of going and participating. But sometimes rewarding brave behaviors, and rewarding, kind of that gradual practice process, can be really powerful. And having that external reward, can help them. But yes, it can be tough. And sometimes there's like a real fear that you can kind of talk about or address. And sometimes there's kind of like, I don't know why, I just am not sure. Sometimes also it can be related to something that like you're not even thinking about. And so like I know for one of our kids, they're super sensitive to sounds, and that can kind of trigger some of their anxiety. And so, hey, like turns out, joining the swim team during practice is really nice. It's not too loud. Swim meets are really loud, and they really don't like those. And indoor swim meets, that is. And so like, hey, this is not actually an enjoyable experience for me. It took us a while to figure that out and put those dots together. But there was kind of refusal for swim meets. And so, it can be really a process of you're playing detective sometimes, and you're trying to figure some of this out. Sometimes you're pulling in other people who like might have a better sense, or you maybe need to talk to one of the instructors at the karate studio, or you maybe need to talk to a coach or somebody else to get a better sense of if something happened, or what that fear might be. But yeah, it's definitely tough, and it's a process. If you have a child who has some anxiety, you can be kind of doing a lot of moving targets sometimes, and trying to, yeah, really kind of investigate, and you sometimes, may need, hey, a couple sessions yourself to kind of get coached on like, hey, how do I support my child, and how do I help them navigate through some of these situations or circumstances. And there's definitely some great resources. Again, keep plugging that blog post, but we definitely put some resources in there, and there's some great websites that you can connect to, as well as some book resources and apps and stuff that sometimes can help parents then be able to play detective more effectively in some of these moments, and be able to then figure out what's the most effective or best kind of intervention to plug in there. But yeah, and if you're seeing this as getting beyond something that you're able to deal with on your own, that's when we think about maybe getting some professional support or help. Hey, if it's starting to interfere with daily life, or it's not just the karate studio, now they don't want to go to school, they don't want to go to grandma's house, they don't want to go anywhere. That's becoming much more kind of impairing or interfering, and you may need to get some outside support to manage that. That's okay. It doesn't mean that you failed. It doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. We just know that some kids are more anxious than other kids, and some kids might need something delivered in a different way than you kind of know about or are aware of, and that's why people like me exist. I can tell you that like our own kiddo, goes and sees a psychologist because it's really helpful, for them to have somebody that's like not their parent, be their psychologist and be able to kind of express and talk to, them about those things. And so, like I'm sitting here as a psychologist, who works with kids with anxiety, and my own kiddo, goes and sees a psychologist for anxiety. And so we know that sometimes there are things that, hey, we need to connect with somebody outside of our house, because your job is not to be their therapist. And while there's interventions and things that you can do, if you're getting to the point where you're like delivering like therapy to your child, it's probably a good time to bring somebody else in so you can get back to being parent, and somebody else can be kind of supporting that. Talk to a licensed professional, psychologists, pediatricians, social workers, licensed therapists. Look for those, people that are kind of delivering that evidence-based, research-based therapies. We know that it's really effective. Exposure-based has the most evidence behind it. There's actually some recent research that shows that, especially for younger kids, the facing the fear exposure type therapy is really highly effective, when kind of done and delivered correctly and effectively. And we see that, it's more effective, especially at these younger ages. And I'm thinking about kind of 10 and under, more effective than medication, more effective than talk therapy. And really, we see kids kind of being able to get back to life and get back on track really pretty quickly. I've had patients who we've done exposure therapy in as little as 4 sessions. We've gone from having school refusal and significant fears to, in 4 sessions, being able to kind of almost stop meeting and kind of discharge from regular therapy because they were using exposure therapy so effectively and so well. Sometimes it takes longer. I'm not going to pretend that everybody is 4 sessions. I've had some patients that I've seen for much more extensive periods, and it can vary, again, kind of depending on your child's age, what the fear is too, and what the anxiety is. And so, certainly, treatment can look different. And then medication is effective. We know most of the research around medication for anxiety, for kids and teenagers, is really kind of with preteens and teens. And so, pediatricians, psychiatrists are able to prescribe that. A couple states, psychologists can, not Delaware, but a couple states they can. And so having, or nurse practitioner or physician's assistant. So lots of great people out there that are able to kind of prescribe and manage medication. Again, really safe, really effective for those preteens and teens. We see that, there's really very few side effects associated with the anti-anxiety medications. And we see that they're really good kind of over long term, although typically for our teens and preteens, kids aren't usually on medication longer than like a year. That's kind of the average for most kids who take medication. And so a lot of this, again, therapy or medication, our goal is we want to get kids back on track and back into life. And then, we maybe don't need all these supports or all these other, things anymore because they're able to kind of get back into, the things that they want to and get re-engaged. And so the goal is not that I want a child to be in therapy with me for forever. I really want to work myself out of a job. And that's my goal with a lot of what I do, including nights like tonight. So just a couple of final things, and then certainly want to jump to questions. But just thinking about prevention, one of the best things that families can do around prevention is kind of thinking about like, how are your routines structured? How are you doing things consistently within your household? And how are things like sleep and eating habits, physical activity, all of those things, people think like, oh, that's like, that's not actually addressing anxiety, or that's not, doing this. But we know that, like, if you're not getting enough sleep, you are more likely to be anxious. You're also more likely to be grumpy and irritable. And so we also know for kids that they need a lot more sleep than I think people realize. So 8 hours of sleep is not a target until adulthood. Realistically, even teenagers, I would love for them to be getting like 9 hours of sleep a night if possible. I know that's not always realistic, and the balance doesn't always work out that way for a variety of reasons. But like your kids that are like 8, 9, and 10 years old, like I would like them to still be getting 10 or more hours of sleep. We know that like they benefit from that rest. And one of the things that happens when kids get good rest is there's a kind of process that actually kind of like cleans your brain, and it washes away some of those worry hormones. And so kids that are having kind of significant chronic anxiety, if they can get really good rest, we actually see that can just in and of itself be a reset. And so sometimes I'm actually doing interventions around sleep or eating habits for kids that maybe are, struggling, and hey, I'm so anxious that I'm not eating breakfast and I'm not eating lunch at school. And so all I'm doing is eating a snack when I get home, and then I'm eating maybe a larger dinner. But like I'm not eating the rest of the day. And so thinking about some of that, I mentioned before, modeling is really powerful for lots of kids. And being able to kind of like show them that, hey, I'm doing relaxation, or like I'm really stressed right now and I need to, go take a break. And my kids know that like if I've had a stressful day, like there's a good chance I'm going to be out in my garden at some point in the evening. Or I may want to, like, depending on if my kids were the stressor, I may want to spend more time with my kids, because it can be really like, cleansing for me sometimes to just like, hey, we're going to play a game. And I'm going to beat you both at Uno and it's going to feel great. Or whatever that might be. It's important to teach your kids how to lose as well. But that's another talk for another time. But, again, praising, rewarding, reinforcing, sometimes it's really important to even kind of be praising and labeling that. So I'm really proud of you for being brave and, going to karate tonight, even though you really didn't want to, or even though you were, afraid that you were going to get hurt. Way to go. And like, you didn't get hurt too, right? And you can counter that anxiety in the same moment. It's important to acknowledge that their anxiety is real, right? Like that they are feeling a real thing, and that there is a real experience that they're having, even if you can't see it or you're not feeling that same fear. It's really, helpful to just kind of acknowledge that. I think this is a really big challenge for parents who maybe weren't anxious children themselves, or generally kind of like are able to kind of go, that's not a big deal. In our household, I was the kid that was like scared of every single monster, and scared of every single thing. I was afraid of Jabba the Hutt when I was a kid. And so like when that came up in our house, I was like, oh, like I've been there. Whereas my spouse is like, horror movie champion and like isn't fazed by any of that. And so it was harder for them to kind of connect with like, you're afraid of Jabba the Hutt? Like that didn't connect as easily for them. And so sometimes it can take practice to kind of reflect back that like, wow, this is real, for you. Again, practice those coping and relaxation strategies. Use those apps to practice with your kids. Use them, before bedtime, or in kind of that like half an hour of wind down time maybe that you have before bedtime. also highly recommend having a half an hour of wind down time before bedtime. That's as few screens as possible, and kind of, thinking about that. And then, again, thinking about like just the lifestyle aspects. Social connection is really important, even for our introverts. We know that this is really helpful and beneficial to have some level of connection, whether it's clubs or sports or camps. And certainly, I think everybody probably who's on here tonight has some level of enjoyment or love of camps. I have found a huge benefit in my work with campers, but it certainly doesn't have to be camp for every kid. But that social connection is so powerful and so helpful when we're thinking about some of this. So I'm going to kind of stop talking there and happy to kind of jump into some questions. Also very happy, for folks to reach out afterwards, or if you're watching this at another time, and to answer questions in the future too. Always happy to do our best to support y'all as you're on the front lines.
Dr. Radcliff, we're getting some really great questions. So I'm going to just begin if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go for it.
Far away here. So a parent has sent us a question about, are there some situations where it's doing more harm to force your child into situations that are causing anxiety? Similar to karate, this parent's son often cries and refuses to get out of the car for basketball practice. What would you suggest?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I think, in those situations, trying to understand, what the fear is, or what the anxiety is. For some kids, so one of our kids in our household is very introverted. And so for them, like sometimes they don't have the social energy to do practice, do little league practice right now. And so it's like, they're like, I can't go, I'm not going, I can't go. And we, go, okay, like, let's sit down and think about, what can we, do to help you still feel confident about your skills, because you want to go to the game on Saturday or whatever, but you don't want to go to practice tonight. And so like, how do we help you still feel confident about this? How do we help you still, kind of feel interested in this? But also sometimes that's your kid's way of saying that, like, I don't actually like this sport. I don't know if that's the case here. But sometimes that is sometimes a kid's way of like, they don't know how to say that they don't want to do it anymore. And so you get some of that refusal. And then they're worried that they're going to let you down, or they're worried that the fear is actually, or the anxiety is actually that they're, worried about your feelings or your reactions or your responses. And so they don't want to let you down, but they also don't want to do it. And so they're kind of conflicted. And that happens more often than I think a lot of parents are aware of or kind of realizing. And it's not that you're like being a bad parent or you're forcing them, but it's that, hey, like, sometimes kids, just change their mind or have different feelings about things. But I think when we think about it being harmful to like make your child go into a situation, is if they're really dysregulated. So if they are, at a point where they're hyperventilating, they're crying, they are, really upset, you're maybe carrying them into the place. They have friends who are there, so there may be that social component as well. Those types of situations where the stress is really high, is an indicator to me that, hey, we need to probably, kind of take some steps backwards and then maybe take some small steps forwards to get back to going to practice or participating again. But if you're seeing really significant dysregulation, or really kind of significant difficulty, being able to even like physically go in, that's usually a good sign that like, yeah, this is real, and this is, not something that we want to push a child into. Yeah.
Another really great question. I would theme this as like where a child's kind of polarized a bit. And this parent sent in a great question about their 11-year-old son. Really does great in school. As parents, they're always trying to reinforce positive behavior, and they're doing everything they can to spend time with him, both as a family and as and one-on-one. Currently, he's playing baseball and he has fun at practice, laughs, smiles with his friend, But when it comes to game time, he shuts down. It's like everything he learns is lost. And while this particular parent who asked the question isn't competitive uh, and does not matter about the loss, her child really does, feel it and doesn't want to lose. Um, she doesn't like seeing him so frustrated. He cries on the field, and I know the crying embarrasses him. To try to help him with his confidence, the family even got him a couple lessons one-on-one. And again, he does great at practice, but shuts down in the moment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this is a process for lots of kids. Some kids show this a little bit more than others. But and I kind of joked about it earlier, but learning how to like lose is really tough for kids. This is one of those things that, lots of kids really kind of struggle with at first and have difficulty kind of adjusting to. And there's kind of like learning how to lose at like Uno at home. And then there's like learning how to lose publicly with like friends around and other people around. And for some kids, that really is like a social anxiety. It's a social, worry that like, what are other people going to think? And especially, you kind of mentioned it too. Then there's kind of that layer on top of like, I'm upset that we lost. And now I'm also worried that like, what are my friends going to think of me? Or like, what is everybody thinking of me as I'm, crying and around other people? And so there's definitely layers, to that. I think it sounds like they're doing lots of great stuff already as far as encouraging and supporting. Sometimes some of the conversations that can be had can be like talking about famous people who lose, right? Or identifying like who their favorite, baseball player might be, and like finding out how often do they lose. Right. Or, like if you look at batting averages, lots of, professional athletes strike out more than they hit home runs. And so, sometimes kind of highlighting that like, wow, there's people who get paid millions of dollars, and they actually hit the ball less than you do, which we actually had that conversation earlier this season with our kiddo, around the fact that they, struck out once during a game and then had 2 hits. And so their batting average, was, 600, compared to, most major league players, around, 200. And so, again, having, some of that context for them, helping them to kind of understand the bigger picture, also just practice losing, right? So like play some games at home where they lose. And maybe you've already had some of those experiences, but sometimes kids just need to actually practice losing. Sometimes also setting the expectation beforehand or finding ways to kind of help them, like, hey, like we're probably going to lose today, right? Like, and that sounds like a weird thought to have, but like, if you go in with the expectation of like, we're probably going to lose, it shifts the kind of thinking, and that, kind of process, for some kids. And so sometimes it's getting creative around like, how do we help them think about this in a different way? Again, sounds like this family's doing lots of great ways or things to already kind of help with some of that. And sometimes it's just kind of an ongoing, experience or process. But yeah, practicing losing, as weird as that sounds, can be really helpful. I've even worked with families where we've like rigged games against their child, who's really struggled with losing, and we've kind of rigged it so that their child like loses regularly, so that like they get used to that and can learn to tolerate that a little bit better. And so yeah, there's a lot that goes into though losing and being able to lose. There are some books out there that are available around kind of like, I think there's even one called like Famous Losers or something along those lines, that's kind of talking about like, hey, here are all these like famous people that have like lost, or done these really cool things, and then everybody knows them for their successes, but also like they lost a lot too, and it's okay. And so it's a process to help kids kind of learn how to lose and learn how to lose more gracefully, perhaps. Yeah. Camp
I
is a
would,
great way.
yeah,
You lose
camp is a
weight.
great way. I would also just add, for an 11-year-old, it definitely, situation awareness definitely kicks in, where that child knows the difference between practice and a game. And so I think humor is really important. I also think that in practice, even at home, just to do those pressure moments of, like, it's the World Series, two outs, three, you're up to bat. And just talking through it, and realizing and letting your child know, like, it's okay to lose. By the way, Michael Jordan didn't even make his high school basketball team until he was a senior in high school.
Yep.
It's those types of moments of just talking through it. Like, the more when you fail, it's just fail fast and keep going. You'll get better. Yeah, we've seen that a lot in the last 20 years, where practice becomes more serious for children as they get older. But in fact, more parents go to practice, and then that puts even that much more pressure on kids when it's game time, versus just letting your kids play hard, have fun, and then eventually help them make that sport theirs, versus them thinking it's your sport that they want you to play. You want them
Yeah.
to play. So, yeah, that's a really great question. Another
Yeah.
question that came here, Doctor, was, how much focus should a parent put into what's going into their child's mouth when it comes to diet? Because a couple of parents have mentioned that, they've put their children on a gluten-free diet and they've seen great results. They've seen the hyperactivity and the anxiety kind of reduced significantly. Talk to us about that a little bit, please.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple things to think about that. So, certainly one, if you have like concerns that your child has like a, um, you know, food allergy, or like, celiacs, or some, sort of kind of GI concern, definitely talk to like a GI professional or a dietitian or both. When we look at some of the research around diet and things like that, we know that kids who are getting a balanced diet, so, think about, we've moved away from the, food pyramid to the, my plate. When we look at that and think about, is there a balance of protein and, along with, kind of fiber, so that's what I think about for like fruits and vegetables or fiber, as well as, kind of getting a range of, colors of food, which is where you're kind of getting then probably different vitamins, in. And so really trying to kind of diversify your kids' diets, really important. We know that there's a gut-brain connection. So we know that, people who have kind of an unhealthy digestive system, so maybe you don't have enough bacteria in your gut, or, for whatever reason, you're having other, kind of things. So certainly we know that like kids or people who have lots of upset stomach and then lots of diarrhea, it's harder for their gut to kind of be healthy. And that can have a real impact, kind of back onto then your brain and your brain health. As far as like gluten-free diet, when we track that specifically, connected to mental health, there's not any research that supports that specifically. However, having said that, there's certainly kids who may have undiagnosed, gluten allergy or celiac disease or something like that, or maybe a mild form of that, where, hey, removing, gluten from their diet is benefiting them. I think the other thing that we see is that when we think about gluten-free diets, a lot of times, people are shifting away from lots of heavily processed foods. And so a lot of times when we're hearing people talk about some of that stuff, we're seeing people eating, kind of, less processed, less, kind of, the like white flour, white sugar, type of diets, and moving into a more balanced diet, for their kids. And so sometimes that's actually the effect that we're seeing, is that it's kind of a more effective balanced diet for their child. Also certainly like you have your kids who are like, super picky eaters. And that can be really tough. And you're like, I know my kid is not eating vegetables. And like, we need to figure out a way to make this happen. And so, again, sometimes working with like a registered dietitian, and somebody that's, kind of licensed, specifically, for kids, around kind of like what is a good way to kind of balance some of this out and work on some of this can be really helpful. And can go a long way. So yeah, I mean, it's tough figuring out like what should I put in my kid's mouth? What's appropriate. I actually also saw that somebody asked a question about chewing and biting on like shirts and stuff like that. And so certainly that can be a sign of anxiety too. And so the mouth can be a good way to assess whether your kid has some anxiety. Certainly chewing on non-food stuff can be a sign that kids are anxious. Also, increased appetite or decreased appetite can be a sign that your child is anxious. And so sometimes those eating habits, or changes in eating habits, can be a way that you're, hearing from your child, that they're feeling anxious. And again, sometimes it can also be a way that you can intervene or better support them, and work on some of that gut health and some of those types of things. Yeah. Yeah. Great question.
Thank you, Doctor. One last question.
Yeah.
What would you recommend for first-time campers? It's just like first-time students at a new year for school. What would be some great tips for them?
Yeah, great question. And I think in my camp days and experiences, we think about things like orientations being really powerful and helpful. So whether it's a virtual orientation or an actual in-person orientation, helping your anxious kiddo have kind of a sense of what's coming, understanding kind of like what if it's a week-long camp or if it's a whole summer camp or whatever that might be, giving them like a sense of what it's going to look like. What's the schedule going to look like? Is it going to be similar to during the school year? Is it going to be different? What can they expect? Are there any people that like they might know or be able to meet before camp, that help them feel more comfortable? Are they able to go with a friend? Things like that can be really powerful. So, again, I think this comes back to like the schedules and routines part of prevention. The more you can kind of give some preparation, help them understand kind of the structure and what to expect. That can go a long way in kind of setting you up for success. And especially around those transition points from, school to summer to camp, or from camp to summer to school, or that last week of summer, before school starts, those transition points can be tough. And so helping your kids know what to expect and walking them through like, hey, like you have, 3 days, between the end of school and like the weekend, and then you've got a weekend, and then we're going to start camp. And so we're going to still get up at the same time every morning on these 3 days, because we want to help keep you in that routine and help keep you in that schedule. And so sometimes just kind of thinking ahead and doing a little anticipation yourself, can go a long way, but also working with the camp. Reach out to the camp director, reach out to the counselor that may be kind of working more directly with your kiddo. Hey, they're nervous, they have anxiety, or they often are kind of initially anxious and shy and like may need a little bit more support or help, or kind of talking to them, and getting a little bit more sense. I don't think I've ever met a camp director or a camp counselor who is like, I don't care about your kid's anxiety. They're like, no, we are really excited that your kid is coming, even though they're anxious, and we want to help them be successful and have fun. And we want them to be able to have a great time. And so starting that connection and that communication before camp even starts can be really powerful. And can be really helpful, again, especially with some of those transitions, and that type of stuff. But yeah, great question. And definitely something to be thinking about again, especially as we're about to hit a transition point here coming up soon.
Doctor, we've got actually two really great questions too before we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Might help for that transition period, as well as some current situations that parents have going on. One question was, does biting the sleeve of one's clothes and the strap of his school bag is that a sign of anxiety? In case yes, does it mean that if they do it in school but not at home, does that anxiety exist, and is it linked to the school environment only?
Yeah, it's a great question. And with I had kind of seen it pop up as I was talking about some of the food stuff before. And yeah, I think when we think about, chewing on things, that can be a sign of anxiety. It can also be a sensory seeking behavior to manage anxiety. So some kids actually chew on stuff and it's relaxing for them. And so there's like awesome, necklaces that they can chew on or bracelets they can chew on to like save the collar or the cuff of their sleeves, and protect your shirt. And so there's lots of ways to kind of like work around that for some kids. But we know that sometimes kids will seek out sensory experiences to help them relax, right? So that can be anything from chewing on something to rocking to, rubbing something soft or touching something, to other kinds of fidgeting. And so, yeah, it can be a sign of anxiety and kind of a way that maybe they're coping with that anxiety. Just because they're doing it mainly in one setting doesn't necessarily mean that the anxiety is just linked to that setting. It may mean that like, hey, this is the only coping strategy I've figured out for that setting. Whereas when I'm at home, I can go do this, or I can go do that, or I've got, all these other options that kind of help me feel relaxed or help me feel calm. And so I can use a lot more skills to be relaxed. But it may be a symptom of like, hey, there's more anxiety at school, or they're more nervous about school, maybe having a little bit of social anxiety or something like that. So I feel like that was a great non-answer to the question there. But again, certainly depends. And so, but yeah, certainly something, worth thinking about. And if nothing else, highly recommend some of those like chew necklaces and things like that. Can save you so much headaches on the shirt collars and cuffs and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, one last question before we wrap up. This is a single dad who shares custody of two children. His ex and he have been in counseling with both children for about 18 months now. Their 10-year-old daughter is well adapted to the changes and coping quite well, but their 11-year-old son is extremely angry, has said he's depressed, and has gotten extremely moody, angry, and stressed out when he is at home with dad. This results in a lot of difficulty falling asleep. It has affected his eating, willingness to go to school, being social with friends, and the parent is asking any suggestions or tips you could recommend.
Yeah. Yeah. And one, I love hearing that you are, kind of working on that counseling angle. And, I think that's often a good piece when we're thinking about some of these transitions or adjustments. Certainly, sometimes some of that needs to be shaken up though as well. And so I'm not sure the structure, sometimes kind of family therapy where everybody's kind of working together is helpful. Sometimes individual therapy at this age can be really helpful, and having kind of their own space. Sometimes doing both can be helpful. Additionally, we see for some kids that they really struggle kind of adjusting between households. So for some kids, that transition is really difficult. And some kids just struggle with transition in general. And so maybe it was something that you didn't notice a whole lot before because, hey, like, this wasn't a thing that happened before, and we were able to kind of anticipate and predict and manage some of this when they were younger, in easier ways. And now as they're older, it's kind of coming out in more and different ways. And so sometimes then figuring out how do we kind of support these transitions, or try to reduce the transition effect or impact. What are the things that we're doing that can be consistent between households? What are things that we can be kind of supporting in that way? Are there things that are important for us to be thinking about when it comes to sleep? Maybe one house there's a fan and the other house there isn't, and like, hey, we just need to get a fan in the other house, and then suddenly this is a problem solved, and they're able to sleep easier. So sometimes it's problem solving around some of those stuff. or those things might be things that you've already kind of problem solved around. Additionally, just kind of, focusing on kind of small steps first, picking kind of one, thing that you want to work on. What's the priority? What's the goal right now? What are his goals or priorities as well? And helping him to kind of figure out like what's important, right? As parents, we want them to sleep better, eat better, and go to school and be successful. And we want all of that for our kids, but we may need to say, okay, I'm not as worried about school with, 2 weeks left in school. And I want to focus more on, being able to, support the sleep. And so the whole focus is going to be on sleep right now. And so we're going to kind of tackle that and work on that. And then maybe kind of, take some steps then towards eating. And then, hey, by the time, school rolls around in the fall, maybe we can then, be kind of ready to go for school and worked on some of that. So it can be a process, it can be a slow process. And that can be really hard for parents, especially as you're watching your child be unhappy or be stressed or be worried. And you want to fix it right away, and you may not be able to fix it right away, and that is really tough as a parent, and that can be really challenging. And so making sure you're taking care of yourself in these times and these processes is really important. And that's a key to successful parenting in general, is making sure you're doing some good self-care, and really, doing your best to kind of take care of yourself in these moments too. It's hard. Being a parent is tough work. Whether you're a single parent or whether you have two parents in the household and lots of great supports around you, still can be really hard and really challenging. And so be kind to yourself. I have no doubt that all of you that are watching this are fantastic parents. It's part of why you're here, and you're thinking about, how do I support my kid, and how do I do best for them? And so you're already taking some great steps in the right direction. And sometimes you gotta kind of be kind to yourself too. And I know you can do it.
Dr. Radcliff, this has been wonderful. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your wisdom, for some really great tips. Nemours has a wonderful website, two of them, nemours.org as well as kidshealth.org, where you can find tips from Dr. Radcliff as well as all the great folks at Nemours. It's right there at your fingertips. Also, there's many people that were involved in tonight's presentation. We want to thank everybody behind the scenes, both from Nemours and also from the ESF team. Thank you all for participating. It was a wonderful night. Dr. Radcliff, thank you again for your wisdom, and we really look forward to another webinar in the coming weeks.
Yeah, my pleasure. Always a pleasure to be with you all, and hope everyone has a great summer at camp.
Thank you again. It's going to be a great one. Thank you all.
Absolutely.
Good night.